Hi everyone, I'm Luke Warrington, and this will be the data and analysis presentation for my project this semester, Effects of COVID-19 on Global Airline Travel. So the first bit will be a review just of what I'm doing and the variables involved. So as an introduction, the onset of COVID-19 has deeply impacted a lot of global markets, and one of them is airline travel. It was projected to shrink quite a bit, and it is an immense market. And so, according to the CDC, traveling in close contact with other individuals may increase the risk of contracting or spreading COVID-19. That's pretty straightforward. And because millions of people worldwide rely on this industry, it's not enough to just blame things on the virus, but it's necessary to study the specific effects of economic damage, lockdown policy, death rates, and public opinion on the success of the industry. And because the vast majority of airline ridership is accounted for by passenger airlines, this study will primarily focus on passenger airlines. And it will be a study of ridership during the year 2020 during the pandemic. And so for a sample, we have data on airline seats occupied at 11 of the world's largest airports. This will be data measured monthly from February to June for a total of 55 observations. 5 months over 11 airports for 55 observations. The airports included will be those of Atlanta, Tokyo, London, Los Angeles, Chicago, Paris, Singapore, Amsterdam, Dallas, and Istanbul. This data was collected from the Official Aviation Guide of the Airways, which is an international travel data provider specializing in aviation. The dependent variable here will be the number of seats occupied at each airport during each month. And so OAG compiled a more complete set, and that original set had ridership data for the world's 20 largest airports for each month of 2020 up until September. Now, the way that they determined which airports qualified as the largest airports was based on the capacity rankings of that month, but in the year 2019. So I know that's confusing. If you look on the left, you'll see an example of what I'm talking about. For February of 2020, so this data on the left here is showing February of 2020, but the 20 airports that were chosen were the 20 largest by capacity during February of 2019. So what that means is with each month, the 20 largest by capacity are fluctuating. You have some that stay in the general same position, but by and large, the list is going to change every month. And so for the sake of consistency, I chose 11 airports that appeared consecutively on the list over the 5 months in this study, February to June. And that, once again, is because the 20 largest airports by capacity would shift every month. The original data set, as I mentioned before, also included data spanning from February to September of 2020, but it was difficult to find forecasts and data from reputable sources at the time where I completed my proposal pertaining to Q3 GDP for each of the 8 host countries included. And so my project will focus on Q1 and Q2 GDP. So why did I choose airline seats occupied as the dependent variable? Well, the number of seats occupied should be a direct indicator of consumer participation in the global airline industry. This is because 1 seat occupied is generally equivalent to 1 ticket purchased. And obviously more tickets purchased would indicate a more healthy industry. Also, the 11 airports that I've selected are spread far around the world, and they're among the largest in the world. And so they should give us a very clear idea of what exactly is happening on a global standpoint. The first independent variable that we'll have in this study is the percent change of GDP of the countries in which the airports are located, measured quarterly. And that'll be year on year. So these quarterly reports are the percent change in GDP as compared with the same quarter of the previous year, adjusted for inflation. Once again, it was difficult to find reputable Q3 data for all of the 8 countries involved. So only Q1 and Q2 will be included. And these quarters span the months of January through June. Once again, January is excluded, and it is excluded because for starters, the virus hadn't really begun at that point. And secondly, I only had airline data beginning in February. So the relevant theory here is that if airline travel is a normal good, demand for it should increase as consumer income increases. So if the GDP increases and airline travel is a normal good, we should see more people buying tickets, and we should see greater ridership in the dependent variable. So my hypothesis for this variable is that percent change in GDP should have a significant and positive correlation with the number of seats occupied monthly. Um, One thing to note is that although seasonality may affect some of the airports, the data is too limited to control for this, and so it won't be a factor that's included in my study. The second independent variable will be the presence of a government-enforced lockdown affecting the airports at the city or country level from February to June of 2020. Initially, I planned to use a dummy variable, but decided to use a quantitative variable instead. So my initial plan was to put a 1 or a 0 in each month just to signify that a lockdown was going on for most of that month. But instead, I ended up putting the number of days of each month during which each airport was affected by a lockdown. This ended up giving a much clearer indication of how much time the particular airports were on lockdown. The assumptions I'm making here are that intuitively, lockdowns should affect the number of people traveling through the airports, and we also are going to assume that people are compliant with their government's requests. This might not be true in reality, but I don't have enough data to figure out which countries are disobeying their governments, and to be fair, neither do those countries. Mandatory stay-at-home policies will be considered lockdown policies as well. A question that I got quite a bit in response to my proposal was, why not analyze travel bans? Well, doing so would involve determining which banned, quote unquote, countries account for the greatest percentage of ridership at each of the 11 airports. That is a lot of data, and it's not readily available to me, so it won't be included in this study. And then finally, my hypothesis for this variable is that airports affected by lockdowns should see fewer seats occupied, and a negative relationship should exist between lockdowns and ridership. A third independent variable we'll be working with will be the confirmed death toll due to COVID-19 in each of the countries whose airports are represented. And once again, it'll be measured monthly from February to June of 2020. The raw death toll for each country, so that we have a consistency, will be divided by the total population of that country and then multiplied by 100,000. We're multiplying by 100,000 so that we'll have number inputs that are easy to see. We won't have 0.000, and it'll be a lot easier to make the comparison. The assumptions we're making here are that a greater death toll in a country is indicative of greater public fear of the virus, which should lead to less air travel, as the risk of contracting the virus is higher on airplanes. And so another question that I got in response to my proposal was, why not use COVID-19 cases instead of deaths of due to COVID-19? And so this is for a few reasons. And the main reason being, COVID-19 deaths are objective, and COVID-19 cases are very hard to determine. Few countries have accurate data regarding who has the virus. Some countries even have accurate data but aren't forthcoming about it. Testing varies heavily between countries, and many individuals likely have the virus but are asymptomatic. That's the case in the United States, and it's the case everywhere. Our hypothesis for this variable is that a significant negative correlation could exist between the death toll and the number of seats occupied, or it should exist rather. So our first dummy variable will be month of the year. It'll be a dummy variable, and it will be relative to the month of June. So we will have independent variables for the months of February, March, April, and May. And then the month of June will be excluded as the excluded category from the regression. For each month's column, a 0 or a 1 will be used to signal whether the observation was taken during that month, and then we'll interpret the coefficients once again relative to June. And so a positive regression coefficient means that for that month, ridership was up in comparison to the month of June. This variable is included to try and account for any unobserved factors pertaining to the time of year that may have affected ridership during the virus. And my hypothesis for this variable is that we'll see a trend of more ridership and then less ridership as the virus progresses. In earlier months, more airline seats will be occupied relative to the month of June. And in other words, a significant positive correlation should exist between the earlier months of February and March and airline seats occupied. I didn't know what would happen in the later months. The second dummy variable we'll be using is global region. Just like the first one, we will be excluding one of the categories. So the three regions I'll have for this variable will be North America, Asia, and Europe. It's important to note that Turkey will be considered part of Europe instead of part of Asia. For each month's column, a 0 or a 1 will be used to signal whether the observation was taken within that region. And the resulting coefficients will show ridership relative to North America, the excluded category. And so once again, a positive regression coefficient means more ridership than was observed in North America, and a negative coefficient will mean less ridership than was observed in North America. This is intended, once again, to account for unobserved factors, this time pertaining to regions of the world, which may have affected ridership. And my hypothesis was that because the U.S. contains multiple hub airports, North America would have the greatest occupancy. And I figured that Europe would have the least, and so a negative correlation would exist there. I figure Asia has a larger population density than Europe, but I don't know what exactly the results will be for Asia. And so here's my methods section. Here's my regression model. On the left, occupancy by seat is the dependent variable. And then you can see each of the regression coefficients multiplied by each of the independent variables. Once again, note that the June dummy and North America dummy are excluded. You can see the intercept, and then at the end, you can see the random error term. Here are my summary statistics for my sample, or rather for the regression as a whole. Take a moment to look at them if need be. And so here are the regression results in a correlation matrix. We'll go through each independent variable one by one. One thing I want to point out about the regression results table is that for R squared and adjusted R squared, we have a fairly high value. 0.84 means that 84% of the variation in our dependent variable, airline occupancy, was accounted for by the variables as a whole in our regression. So that is good news. But again, looking at the asterisks here, you can see that none of the continuous variables, aside from the dummy, none of the non-dummy variables, the continuous variables, were statistically significant. And so we'll get to that in just a moment. Regarding the correlation matrix, once again, my main focus is on the continuous variables. Do note a correlation of negative 0.49 between days of the month on lockdown and percent change in GDP per capita or per quarter year on year. This is not extreme, but it is a moderate negative correlation, and it's worth noting. I think that for future work on this regression, or rather on this topic, people shouldn't run regressions with both percent change in GDP and days of the month on lockdown as independent variables if they're studying the coronavirus, because intuitively, I think what happened was the longer people were on lockdown, the lower GDP became because people weren't able to go to work and increase the GDP. So here are the results for the first independent variable, changes in GDP at the country level. So a strong positive correlation with occupancy was observed, and that's what I had predicted would happen. It was strong at 0.8, and that is consistent with the hypothesis. A 1% increase in GDP led to an increase of 4,553 seats, according to the regression. However, the main takeaway here is that the p-value was 0.8. I mean, that is a huge p-value, so the results were far from statistically significant. Intuitively, an effect should have been present, as theory indicates that if airline ridership is a normal good, then it should be positively correlated with income. And income, of course, income was intended to be indicated by GDP here. So one potential explanation of this is omitted variable bias, and I will get to that in a later slide. The second variable, days of month under lockdown, basically had a similar story. It had a moderate negative correlation with occupancy, which is what I predicted. A 1 day increase in the amount of time under lockdown led to a decrease of 11,806 seats in airline occupancy. However, the p-value was 0.258. Again, this is lower than the last one, but still not close to statistical significance. Once again, an effect should have been present. Just intuitively, if you're under lockdown, you're not able to go fly. But once again, omitted variable bias may have been the issue here, meaning that other variables may have played a larger role in the change or in affecting occupancy. And then finally, confirmed deaths due to COVID-19 adjusted for in population. We saw a negative correlation here as well. Sorry, it says inflation at the top, but it should say population. We saw a moderate negative correlation with occupancy here as well at negative 0.4. And that was consistent with the hypothesis. According to the regression, 1 death led to a decrease of 5 seats. This was the lowest p-value so far at 0.198. And out of the 3 variables we discussed, has had the best chance of actually having an effect on occupancy, but the results are still not statistically significant. This could indicate that public fear of death due to the virus did not inhibit people from flying. But another likely explanation is that if we had had more data, statistically significant results may have been observed. We only had 55 observations, and we only surveyed 11 airports, but with a greater sample, we may have seen a statistically significant relationship there. So the results for the first dummy variables month of the year, as I predicted, February and March had many more seats occupied than in the month of June. The February correlation coefficient was moderately positive at 0.4, and the March correlation coefficient was pretty positive as well at 0.5. They had very low p-values. Results for both of these months were statistically significant, indicating that in February and March, ridership did go up, and it likely the fact that these observations were taken in February and March likely meant that occupancy was higher. For April, more seats were occupied than in the month of June, but the correlation coefficient with regards to general occupancy was negative at 0.3. This was not a statistically significant relationship. And for May, there were fewer seats occupied than in the month of June, with a correlation coefficient on occupancy overall at negative 0.4. Once again, this was not statistically significant. Overall, these results confirm my hypothesis, and I'll explain why. Month of the year clearly affected global occupancy, and the earlier months showed strong, positive, statistically significant relationships with occupancy, while the later months began to trend toward a negative correlation. So you can see this trend over the course of the year as more people choose to fly on airways as the virus is just getting started, and then fewer and fewer people choose to do so towards the end. Now, we did see greater ridership in June than in the month of May, for instance. But overall, you see that downward trend. And what this means is that, yes, month of the year did have an effect, and it indicates that other unobserved factors pertinent to month of the year influence ridership. So this supports the idea that omitted variable bias may have been present. The other dummy variables, or dummy variable, I suppose, global region, was also consistent with my hypothesis. In Europe, fewer seats occupied than North America were observed. The correlation coefficient was slightly negative at negative 0.2, but it was statistically significant, not just at the p is less than 0.05 level, but at the p is less than 0.01 level. For Asia, remember, I predicted that I wouldn't exactly know what would happen with Asia. I predicted it as the sort of middle region in terms of occupancy. Fewer seats were occupied than North America, but more than Europe. And the correlation coefficient was slightly positive at 0.1 and not statistically significant. Overall, these results are consistent with my hypothesis for the region variable. North America had a greater occupancy than Asia, which had a greater occupancy than Europe. And the fact that Europe was negatively correlated with occupancy indicates that unobserved local factors such as population density may have been affecting occupancy. So the region in which the observations were taken certainly played a role here, and we are certainly missing things from our model to explain this. It's very similar in this case as with the month of the year variable. And so I wanted to end the results section with just a disclaimer about omitted variable bias. I mentioned that earlier. The 3 continuous variables included in the study all failed to exhibit the 95% confidence level necessary for concluding that an effect was present for each of them. Intuitively, it's unlikely that none of these variables played a role, but failure to ascertain strong relationships was probably due to the omission of other explanatory variables. These might have included things like population density, considering the areas surrounding the airports, participation of different people groups and countries, and mask wearing. Obviously, that prevents the virus from spreading. And then the geographical pattern over which the virus spread. Remember, the virus didn't spread, in a nice increasing circular pattern like maybe like a wildfire would. It spread in a very nuanced way. It spread when people took trips to different countries, and it wasn't a clean spread. And so this might well have affected the way that occupancy showed up in the over the course of the 5 months. And there were many other factors which also may have affected occupancy as a whole. As a supplement, I ran a regression without the region variable. I did this first and then added the region variable as per the recommendation of a student in response to my proposal. But as you can see, the results are largely the same. Still, the 3 main variables about which I was concerned, percent change in GDP, the presence of a lockdown, and the deaths due to the virus, they were not statistically significant. And February and March, once again, were. So we have very similar results here, but just without the presence of the region variable. And then here is my bibliography. It's very small. If you're interested in learning this particular sources of my information, I recommend that you look at my DNA paper because it will have all of them in much larger font for you to look at. That concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening, and I look forward to all of your feedback. Thank you. Bye.